Also to our speakers, depending on where in the world you're joining us from, a very warm good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you. My name is Vinika Rao. I'm director of the INSEAD Africa Initiative and the Hoffman Institute. And we're delighted to be collaborating with our INSEAD South African National Alumni Association to bring you this very topical webinar following Africa's inaugural G20 presidency. And also to celebrate and highlight the themes of that presidency, some very important themes in that regard, solidarity, equality, and sustainability, which have all been focal under this G20 presidency. Before we proceed with the discussion today, I'll take this opportunity now to briefly introduce you to the INSEAD Africa Initiative so you can know what we do and you know where to find us if there's any suggestions or ideas that you might have for a possible collaboration. So the INSEAD Africa Initiative, or IAI as we call it, is an illustration of INSEAD's long and rich relationship with Africa. We believe that business has tremendous potential to be a force for economic, societal, and environmental progress in the continent. And we also believe that responsible business leaders who have the ability to combine profit with purpose can work together to create a better collective future for all of us in Africa and beyond. Also, that sound business education, like we aim to provide at INSEAD, is in fact the engine for creating such leaders. Our aims at the Africa Initiative are twofold. First is to enhance learning about Africa, its people, environment, businesses, and innovations through knowledge creation and dissemination at INSEAD. And secondly, to enhance INSEAD's contribution to Africa's education, business and policy environment through sharing educational best practices and creating a vibrant community for interaction. If you'd like to know more about our work or have any ideas for collaboration on cases, on research, knowledge partnership, or events, do please get in touch with us. You can reach us at our website or perhaps follow us on LinkedIn, and I'll request Jean, our wonderful coordinator at the Africa Initiative, to put both our website and our LinkedIn page details in the chat function so you know where you can find us. We would love to hear from you. So moving on to our webinar for today, I'd like to invite first our opening speaker, Ms. Sithembile Ntombela, who's the Marketing General Manager of Brand South Africa, with whom we're very happy to be collaborating for this webinar today. She will start us off by delivering an opening keynote address, highlighting the significance of South Africa's G20 presidency and some important facets of it, including perhaps partnerships and multilateralism. Before she does that, let me embarrass her a little bit by giving you a brief introduction to her. I'm certainly not going to be able to do justice to the wonderful career she's had, but at least a brief introduction. Sithembile is a consummate marketing and communications executive. She's had over 25 years of experience spanning both the private and public sectors. She honed her classical marketing expertise at globally recognized brand-led organizations, many of which you'll be familiar with: Unilever, Tiger Brands, Nampak, Food Corp, and Pioneer Foods. At Brand South Africa, an entity which is responsible for managing the country's global image and reputation, she has spent the past 13 years in various leadership roles, including as General Manager of Marketing and Acting CEO. She has played a pivotal role in shaping nation branding initiatives, both domestically and across the continent. A very warm welcome to you, Sithembile, and over to you. Sithembile, could I ask you to unmute yourself and start giving us your opening address, please? Thank you. Just unmute yourself, please.
Great stuff. Can you hear me now?
We can indeed.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And good afternoon to the fellow colleagues that are joining us online. Today, it gives me so much pleasure to welcome you all at this special webinar as I welcome you as a member of Brand South Africa, a lady who has been flying the flag of South Africa for many, many years. This webinar is very special in that it is just not the first webinar that we have done in collaboration with INSEAD. This webinar is a culmination of a collaboration that has been strategic over this time as we've been implementing a number of webinars, actually culminating into the G20. So this webinar is a celebration of Africa's first G20 presidency, which was anchored on the pillars of solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And all of these pillars were cemented on the foundations of inclusion. It is for this reason, ladies and gentlemen, that this webinar is being hosted on INSEAD's Africa Initiative in collaboration with INSEAD Hoffman Institute. That is why the South African INSEAD alumni reached out to their fellow Nigerian counterparts to include the young entrepreneur from their country on this panel, which I'm quite certain you'll be blown away by the remarkable insight from this young one, which I call the young champ. The collaboration between Brand South Africa and INSEAD, as I've said, came right at the right time. It gave us so much access and depth in terms of accessing the like-minded stakeholders who championed panels. We collaborated at the Young Entrepreneurs Alliance, which we hosted successfully in September, hosting over 1,000 of global delegates. We've also collaborated on what we called Global INSEAD Day, which was also quite successful, and it was anchored on the theme bridging communities and connecting the world. So it gives me so much pleasure that today marks the third installment of our collaboration, and I'm certain that this is not the last one. This relationship really is for keeps. Distinguished guests, South Africa's G20 chairship came at a time when the world is facing so many difficulties. The global economy is facing substantial headwinds, emanating largely from an increase in trade and tensions and heightened global policy uncertainty, which has caused even the emerging markets to suffer the most and feel the tensions. The weak outlook that we have seen limits the ability to boost job creation and to reduce extreme poverty levels. But despite these odds, South Africa was able to host what His Excellency President Ramaphosa has hailed as the Summit of the People. It's the Summit of the People as it celebrated South Africa's social cohesion, the spirit of Ubuntu, which overwhelmed so many of our global audiences and actually inspired them to even come to South Africa beyond G20. And the global recognition for hosting a successful event, advancing sustainable development and international cooperation. We saw, ladies and gentlemen, the two-day summit brought together 42 countries and institutions. And there were about over 150 meetings that were held. And for the very first time, the G20 was hosted on the African soil, placing the continent at the center of global discussions on development, climate, and economic stability. The achievement was far from more than proving South Africa's excellence in hosting mega events, because this is not just one of the events we have hosted. We have hosted many prestigious engagements in South Africa. To me and to my fellow South Africans, it symbolized the capacity of a united country to assert itself on the world stage. South Africans from all walks of life, government, civil society, academia, private sector, all collaborated with a remarkable cohesion to deliver a historic event. Central to the summit's legacy was its focus on African continent and the wider global south, including the high public debt, which was topical in the discussions, the energy poverty, food insecurity, and climate resilience. Now, let me indulge you to take you through to some of the few highlights in terms of outcomes that emanated from the G20. There was a clear commitment to improving debt frameworks, particularly for the developing economies. And I'm saying this against the backdrop of the World Bank report that actually symbolizes and caution a great threat amongst the emerging economies, and yet a great opportunity that when we collaborate strategically, we can tap into that opportunity and reverse the slow declines that we've seen over the years. The second one, in terms of the critical outcomes, was mobilizing finance for just energy transition, including tripling renewable energy capacity. And ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a discussion in today's webinar. And I do have my fellow colleague, Mzila Mtenjane, who will be touching on this in detail. The third issue was relating to women and SMMEs, which is quite pertinent as it also finds expression in the Agenda 2063. That tells you that South Africa is intentional about growing women and growing the youth population. So those issues also found in expression, and they've got their clear outcome and action plan. The G20 Critical Minerals Framework reaffirmed that sovereign right of nations to develop their minerals resources to promote inclusive growth, industrialization, job creation, and sustainable value chains, ensuring that Africa benefits from its resources. And lastly, supporting the AU, African Union's comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, as well as what we call the AFCFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. So hosting G20 has enhanced South Africa's reputation. So it's not that we showed up and we showed the world that South Africa is a country that is punching above its weight. We have enhanced and advanced the country's nation brand reputation. We've seen this from the tonality and from the mood boards that we've picked up from the global communities. And I bet you, ladies and gentlemen, the global reputation study will prove me right, because we have seen that this is one country in the tip of the African continent, but that seemingly seems to compete with the other developed nation in other areas of competitiveness. As I end, ladies and gentlemen, the spirit of resilience, of Ubuntu and determination will always be at the center of how we project ourselves to the world. Because when South Africans stand together, we can achieve what many regard as impossible, as we have done so. We are truly a nation of boundless possibilities. We are truly beyond the imaginable. And ladies and gentlemen, as they have said and they have told us many times, we are a nation that is beyond extraordinary, a nation that forges ahead, breaking new ground and inspiring new ways. And I sincerely hope that discussion this afternoon will inspire that hope and inspire a sense of independence of the African continent, and also ignite collaboration throughout the global communities, particularly like INSEAD, who have been with us on this journey and have pledged to continue to do so. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Zembile, for that very inspiring opening note. The pillars of solidarity, equality, and sustainability. How wonderful that sounds. And indeed, as you so eloquently mentioned, there has perhaps never been a more important time in history when these principles are more required. So thank you for touching upon those. And now to discuss some of the themes that you spoke about, let me invite our wonderful panelists today for this discussion. We have just the right people to address each of the themes. I will introduce each of them very briefly to you. And again, before I do that, my apologies in advance if I mispronounce any names. At INSEAD, I always say we can have as many as 90 nationalities present in one classroom at any one time. So you can imagine how many ways my own name has been pronounced in. And I always say it's wonderful to just find different ways that people say the same name. And I hope you'll allow me the same latitude today. So here goes. We have with us Mr. Zila Tenjane, who is the CEO of Minerals Council South Africa. Zila was previously the executive head for stakeholder affairs at Exaro Resources Limited. He has more than 30 years' experience in the resource business and in investment banking, and is currently the chairman of board of Impact Catalyst and was formerly chairman of the Wits University Mining Engineers Association. Welcome to you, Zila.
Thank you very much.
We also have with us Ms. Vanessa Adams. Vanessa is founder and CEO of Level 4 International. It's a boutique consultancy. She has over 25 years of experience working to drive economic impact at the last mile and to improve supply chains. She has spent over 20 years working to improve livelihoods in 30 African countries with institutions, businesses, women and youth entrepreneurs, and farmers. She has significant leadership and management experience, including as Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and USAID Chief of Party. And Vanessa is also an INSEAD Executive MBA alumna. So welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you very much.
And I know that Vanessa has to leave at some point for the airport, so she'll continue to be with us, but might have to switch to audio or perhaps just from her phone. So Vanessa, we will enjoy your lovely smile for as long as you can be with us.
Thank you. It's INSEAD in motion. Global INSEAD entrepreneurship in motion. Thank you.
In motion, absolutely. And I'd also like to introduce another INSEAD alumna, Miss Ire Adrenoken, who is the co-founder of Helicarrier. Ire is an investor, entrepreneur, and software engineer with a decade of experience building and backing technology ventures in frontier markets. As an invited Google expert in web technologies, she has authored widely read technical content and spoken at conferences worldwide. She co-founded Helicarrier, a blockchain company for Africa that built some of the continent's earliest crypto fintech products. And she's passionate about how technology can support global financial inclusion. And that's certainly something that we want to talk about today, Ira. So thank you so much, Ira, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Before I ask the first question to the panel, if anyone in the audience has any comments or other questions that you'd like us to address, please send them in via the Q&A box. And I know we'll get a lot of questions and comments subsequently when this video is aired, but let's start off with some of these questions that I have in mind already on the themes that were touched upon in the opening address also. So Zila, coming to you first with a serious question absolutely along the lines of your work in the minerals, in critical minerals framework that you're so sort of aware of. Now, South Africa's declaration reaffirmed support for the G20 critical minerals framework. It emphasized beneficiation, which is the process of processing raw materials into higher value products, something that's very important for sustainable development, certainly in the emerging market scenario, that we've been familiar with, not just in Africa, but in other very important countries that are growing fast. So tell us, how does the Minerals Council of South Africa, that you're so closely associated with, plan to align its members' strategies and investment priorities with this G20 focus on critical minerals beneficiation? Perhaps specifically touch upon what policy certainty or infrastructure support you think is most urgently required, say from the South African government, to enable the mining sector to meet this mandate, because obviously it's not going to be easy.
Yeah. No, thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. And I think certainly a very exciting conversation on this webinar. So I think in terms of your question, the critical minerals framework that was developed on the G20, which is the main trunk of the summit, whereas I was largely on the B20. And so there were consistent bridges that we needed to build between G20 and B20. And I was fortunate to also have been given some insights into the framework. And it emphasizes a couple of things, but two things that I want to mention related to your question is firstly, speaks about the need for exploration, where the continent actually remains, despite the vast mining that takes place, underexplored. And certainly for my country, South Africa, also has huge opportunity and potential for further exploration. It then also places a significant amount of emphasis on beneficiation, as you mentioned. And this is something that already we would have seen 3 years ago when I think the hype in terms of the scramble for Africa was building momentum, was the immediate response of many African governments that we can no longer continue with the practice of pit to port and these minerals leaving Africa without beneficiation. And so I think as a declaration, that is actually very encouraging. And it's something which we have been quite involved with as a Minerals Council in terms of the debate on beneficiation. And it has many benefits, as we've seen in advanced economies. But I think it does require some fundamentals and basics to be in place first. And you mentioned the first one around a policy environment. And what we've been advocating as the Minerals Council is that it's important to look at the whole value chain from exploration to mining to beneficiation. And I think an opportunity is also presenting itself here where the conversation of beneficiation shouldn't merely be for then the on-selling of those beneficiated products, but in fact the end use of those products on the continent as well. So we need to begin to see ourselves as a market for the very same minerals and metals that the rest of the world requires. And so a policy environment that ensures that you've got a seamless, pathway from exploration, how you translate that exploration prospect into mining development, where you then begin to have significant amount of capital required is important. And then I think when it comes to the beneficiation, it's also recognizing that it's a different industry to mining. And so you want to harness additional capital, capability, and skills beyond those who have developed the mine to then get into the beneficiation and product because they understand the markets going beyond this. So policy plays a very important role. And then the other aspect is then infrastructure. So we are actually right now in the midst of a huge discussion around beneficiation, export restrictions to try and encourage beneficiation, but that may actually have an unfortunate and negative impact. And our emphasis is that one of the fundamental requirements for beneficiation is electricity. And so reliable electricity is important. And in addition to that, affordable and electricity, which makes the beneficiator very competitive. And so I think maybe I'll leave it there in terms of those two essential requirements in as far as beneficiation is concerned. And South Africa has been beneficiating for many years, given where we've come from in terms of our industrialization, where we had amongst the cheapest electricity from Eskom. I think we now have an opportunity where we can, I think, bring that back through extensive investment in renewables to complement our existing coal-based energy. And then I think over time, see that transition happen and dilute the fossil fuel base of our energy into more cleaner energy. And I think that the continent can perhaps leverage on that, and we can talk a little bit about that later in terms of the region and the continent.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. We'll come to that. And as you said, of course, it's very important to consider both the opportunities for exploration and beneficiation. We certainly have opportunities in both. And the need for a policy ecosystem as well as infrastructure that allows for both of these aspects to be successfully done. So thank you for sharing that. Vanessa, I'd like to come to you next with a question on the Ubuntu framework that was referred to in the opening address in the context of data sovereignty and the aspects that you work on. Now, South Africa's presidency has anchored its food security agenda on this Ubuntu approach, emphasizing inclusivity and resilience and shared resilience. So in the context of the G20 Food Security Task Force, how do we then reconcile the B20 push for rapid agri-tech digitization on the one hand with that critical need for African data sovereignty? Because that's becoming quite an issue, as we know. So specifically, what kind of mechanisms do you think need to be introduced to ensure that, for instance, the training data that is generated by millions of African smallholders remains a public good rather than becoming a proprietary asset of external AI firms? Again, to the point of, using a resource, using something that's data that is so critical that comes out of Africa to benefit African entrepreneurs, as opposed to just, then being taken over by the rest of the world.
That is quite a question, Vinica, and maybe it's about 4 questions. So let me unbundle that just a bit, and then I'll have to jump into my taxi. But I want to first start out by saying that it's been a long time in thinking and devising how to really, I think, scale up and unify Africa's voice And I want to just recognize the changes that have come about, I think, in the last 5 years, even with the ratification of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and renewed visibility of what the global community ripple effects into Africa with COVID, with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and then, of course, leapfrogging through new technology access and availability. And as was just said, so rightfully so, the critical dependence on scaling factors in infrastructure like energy and other road networks, ports, and so forth to bring the cost of business down and increase opportunities for Africa to leverage its own vast resources. So, from my perspective, what you're asking about data starts with access to infrastructure and accessibility to be able to compile, use, and optimize that data, both for public good, but also for entrepreneurs to have lower costs and to be able to really capitalize on those investments. So the digitization of agriculture, I think, is the new wave, just like we saw a wave of fintech and a wave of mobile money and accessibility. We have to be able to optimize land utilization. And I just want to speak briefly, there's been a lot of talk globally recently, not just about G20, but of course, the COP in in Brazil, in Belém, and the climate changes realities are looking for and expecting delayed rains, and water availability is also a huge issue on the continent. So we need to be managing water resources differently, and there's ways to digitalize predictability of weather and availability on optimization of the land and water resources as well for food production and productivity. So we've seen a plethora of new strategies across Africa on irrigation, as well as on digitization and data. And so maybe food sovereignty and data sovereignty go hand in hand, because I think you first need, let's say, Maslow's hierarchy of needs to eat and have some shelter and be out of crisis mode. And then you start to talk about optimizing and owning your resources. And that comes to your question about data and protections, both, not just legal protection. We want to see practice and implementation and utilization of the resources which are at hand. And so for me, I just wanted to appreciate your leadership and INSEAD's really renewed efforts to grow and increase focus on Africa and in Africa. And I've been to INSEAD network events in Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, in France, and around the world. And initially, when I started out, Africa was just not a conversation, not a discussion, not so much energy and focus. And so this is really important, and it demonstrates, I think, the renewed network effect and what we see in momentum. And we know that the investment dollars are going to follow. So thanks for those. And I'm going to jump into my transit and join you from my cell phone now as we continue to globalize. Thank you.
Indeed, and thank you so much for that, Vanessa. So, and good to know that you remember Maslow's need hierarchy from your MBA days. And I do want to say a big thank you to you and to our other, alumni and collaborators for your continuing association with INSEAD, because it makes all the difference. We're not going to be able to do any of this alone. So it's very important for everyone who cares about Africa to contribute to it. And Vanessa, you spoke about the need for Africa to leverage its own resources for its own benefit, whether it's about optimizing land or water resources, and of course about digitization, which was my original question, which you sort of really combined very well with all of these other very important resources that we need to focus on. I'm now going to move to Ira. And Ira, coming to you with a question that I know is very close to your heart, to do with youth and women empowerment, which is something that you spent so much time working on. Now, again, South Africa's G20 presidency has placed a heavy emphasis on financial inclusion. But the fact is, we know, and certainly I know this from my own research and my own work, the reality for female founders in Africa, much as it is for female founders in other emerging economies, is often quite stark. I mean, it's also not particularly encouraging in the advanced economies, but certainly in Africa, we do see that this difference comes through very clearly, because reports will consistently show that female-led startups on the continent receive only a single-digit percentage of total venture capital funding, which becomes the gender financing gap, which unfortunately is not showing very encouraging signs of narrowing anytime soon. So as we talk about our theme of solidarity, how do you then reconcile this high-level push for financial inclusion with the daily reality of fundraising in your own capacity as a female African founder who's faced these challenges? Beyond the grants and token accelerators, what specific financial mechanism or policy shift would you request from G20 leaders to move us really from this solidarity as a rhetoric to liquidity in the actual sort of financing aspect?
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, this is definitely a great question and one that I think about a lot, especially in my experience, having experienced basically both sides, right? As a female African founder, and now like as an investor trying to deploy capital as well. And there is certainly this gap, as you've mentioned. I think globally, maybe women-led businesses get about like 7% of global private equity, which is insane when you really think about it. And on the flip side, we actually see that the data shows that female founded businesses are actually more stable, more successful. Like you see, I think there was one statistic from IFC that showed that female borrowers have like significantly, maybe like 50% less default rates than male clients. So there this discrepancy is not necessarily based in the realities of what is different between male and female-led businesses. And I think the reason for this, of course, there are many different reasons. But I would say two main ones are one, of course, like the unconscious bias. Like I think that there's maybe the higher perceived risk for women-led businesses, even though the data shows quite literally the opposite. But I would say even more importantly, it comes down to network effects and just lack of access. So we know that VC in particular is really dominated by male-centric networks. And, if don't have access to those spaces, then it's almost impossible to correct this imbalance. So in terms of what I think could address this, the clear answer is basically like gender lens investing. So making more intentional efforts to support businesses with women leadership. We've seen this happen successfully already. I think there was a recent, or I'm not sure how recent, the IFC had granted a loan to Access Bank in Nigeria of something like $15 million to dedicate credit lines to women. And we saw that this was such a huge success, not just for those women-led businesses, but also the economy as a whole. And I know that, the concept of gender lens investing can be somewhat controversial, particularly nowadays where that sort of thing is not always, top of mind. But I think this doesn't necessarily, we don't need to look at this as something that is going to be permanent and, for the end of time, always having to take this lens. But we know that there is this discrepancy, and we know that it is not because, women-led businesses are not as successful as male-led businesses. So I think it is a temporary measure that we need to take in order to, until we address those root causes of like the bias and the network effects.
Absolutely. And, everything you said resonates very loudly with me indeed. All our research is pointing to exactly what you said in terms of, as you said, perceived higher risks, of course, the network limitations that women have suffered, and to counter it, the need then for intentional gender lens investing, as the example with IFC illustrated, but there are many other such instances. But yes, as you also mentioned, these are challenging times in many ways, and the sort of comments that are coming out of some rather advanced economies can create their own issues, but it's important to sort of keep that force, and again, an opportunity for Africa perhaps to lead the way and to show how this can be done effectively, and perhaps leapfrog some of the relatively so-called advanced nations. Zila, coming to you now and staying with the theme of inclusion and sustainability that we've been talking about with Ira, and we've been talking about from the beginning, really. Now, the global demand for South African minerals is intrinsically linked to the just energy transition aspect, which again is an important theme that we had at the G20 Social Summit. Now, but acknowledging that this shift to green energy must be equitable and inclusive raises its own questions. So what specific measures or commitments are the Minerals Council and its members implementing to ensure that this increased extraction of critical minerals for the global market simultaneously supports a just transition domestically? For instance, in terms of aspects like job creation, community development, and addressing the long-term environmental and social impacts on mining affected areas. How do you see this playing out?
Let me see, I'm not on mute. Okay. It's a question for the whole mining industry and not just South Africa. And I think South Africa has the reputation that I think South African mining industry, from a ESG practice, adoption of sustainable development goals, I think is perhaps leading or amongst the leading industries. And I think also driven by the fact that, we've had what we call a mining charter and various other charters which have been looking at transforming, the form and shape of South African society, given the history that we've come from. So in as far as the role of the mining industry in driving this agenda for transformation and social inclusion, it is not something that will be new in my mind and in my view. And I think a lot of the CEOs would probably agree with that if you look at some of the achievements and accomplishments of the individual companies. And what we've seen, and I think one thing that is important in having this conversation, and what we've seen, is that what is important as we embark on the transition is how you continue to secure the sustainability of the business. So there's an expression that the business case must prevail. And so how mining companies have been responding to the challenges of electricity availability over the past 10 years in South Africa has been actually to invest in renewables, because the policy environment actually changed to enable rapid adoption of renewables in terms of solar and wind. And that response goes to what I'm saying, that in the first instance, in terms of maintaining the business case, it's about ensuring that we're reducing the risk to the business of not having energy and potentially putting many people in danger at first, and potentially putting people out of jobs. And the mining industry in South Africa is actually been leading in as far as investment in renewables, to the tune of about 75% of installed and planned renewables in South Africa is actually driven by the demand from the mining industry, both through direct offtake on site, but also through what we call our wheeling arrangements, if it's going to be wind, which is installed in other places. We're also having conversations about the impact on labor, the impact on communities where mines are located. I think the biggest opportunity, in fact, I see is, as part of this energy transition, the requirement for, and not only energy transition, but I think the technology transition that has been happening and evolving, will be a demand for different and better skills in mining, compared to where mining comes from in South Africa, which was largely about low-skilled and semi-skilled employees. And so as mines adopt new technologies and innovations, they will then also increase the level of demand for higher skilled employees. And that's how we're going to begin to see inclusion. And I think what I'd like to call the power of the mining industry, in terms of the extent of transformation and change it can transmit through the whole economy. And then lastly, it is also looking at the what happens when mining stops, because mining is a transitionary activity in itself. We usually would typically have a transition when a mine stops, and then a new economy should, but in a lot of instances it doesn't come up, and we're beginning to wrap our minds around what are the post-mining economies that we can develop. And I think out of that will then be an additional development of new skills in a new era, 30, 40 years from now when mines close. But I think also leveraging some of the infrastructure that we would have put in place, such as energy, logistics, that can be used for what we call successor economies. So for the mining industry, I think this is presenting, and not just in South Africa, but I think in the rest of the continent, huge opportunities for driving change, for catalyzing some very significant innovations, as well as I think collaboration between countries, but I think within and amongst industries in as far as achieving the social inclusion.
Excellent. Thank you. And as you said, the business case is crucial, especially when we talk about integrating sustainability into the business value chain. And certainly nobody understands better than in this business school environment that we work in. The idea of stopping to think of ESG aspects, sustainability and inclusion aspects as constraints or costs to doing business, and instead viewing them really, the environment and our society, as essential components of the infrastructure that businesses can then actually optimize for their own sort of better business case. So thank you for sharing that. And certainly the role of technology is huge in this regard. Vanessa, I hope you're safely in your car now and able to hear me. Are you with us, Vanessa? Can I address a question to you? Yes.
Sure. Yes, I'm right here.
Okay, wonderful. Okay. So let me go ahead and continue with the question I had for you, which again is the theme of inclusion, and coming back to the ideas of digitalization and everything, that all the challenges that raises. So it becomes even more critical in the context of what you do. So talking about B20 investment versus the digital divide reality. So one of the quotes that I remember coming from the B20 Sustainable Food Systems and Agriculture Task Force was about advocating for enhancing labor and capital productivity through scaling digital tools. But given that the AI for Africa initiative identifies infrastructure as a major bottleneck, and this was mentioned earlier by Zila in some ways also, is there a risk that the B20's investment roadmap disproportionately favors industrial farming operations over smallholders? And perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the specific financing models that you think G20 should then adopt to de-risk AI adoption for the over 30 million smallholder farms that produce most of Africa's food. None of my questions to you are easy, Vanessa, but I'll let you break them up as you go along.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can.
So thankfully I'm in traffic and have plenty of time to talk. I want to address the question of financing inequities in the same way as AI inequities, and I think it was mentioned by Ira or one of the other speakers, but financing agriculture is difficult in any circumstance. If you look at France or Europe or the US, the government has to put in place an ecosystem of financial guarantees and other mechanisms to be able to want to finance agriculture. And India also has taken incredible strides in that regard. And we did a whole discussion about India, Africa, lessons learned not too long ago. But the question that you're getting to around how do we optimize digitalization to be able to reach smallholder farmers and create policy and enabling environments in a way that we don't exclude commercial farms and also investment, because we also need commercial agriculture to be able to create momentum, an ecosystem, accessibility, agri inputs for smallholder farmers to be effective as well. So the best models that I've seen are anchor farm or commercial processing, demand-driven farming investments where you actually have demand momentum processing, and that can drive financing, that drives digitalization, that drives available equipment, better inputs, better utilization of natural resources. And so I think governments have to be daring and creative and bold in to be able to encourage, on the one hand, larger businesses to invest in food production and food processing and put the guarantees in place that incentivize that while creating incentives and momentum for smallholders to be a part of that ecosystem, to be online, to not be feeling that they're taken advantage of, which is often the case when you have traders or spot purchasing or lack of visibility to prices. And so digital technologies have been enabling this more and more through trading platforms, through lowering the costs of financing, through increasing transparency in supply chains and visibility. But a lot of this has to do with global regulatory reforms like the EU deforestation regulation, the UTR, and other compliance, and even South Africa's standards regarding food safety, food quality have also upped the productive capacity and gains that we've seen in Zambia, Mozambique.
Sorry, Vanessa, you're breaking up. We can't hear you very well.
Sorry about that. So anyway, I think I just want to appreciate the ecosystem and strategic investment required and how governments can put in incentives and guarantees using.
Yeah. Thank you, Vanessa. So we got most of what you were saying, only the last part of what I think you were saying. We've got most of it, most of the gist of it, and I'll build upon what you were talking about in my next question to Ira, who can probably tell us a little bit more about this. So Ira, coming to you then to build on what Vanessa was saying and exploring the digital infrastructure divide a little bit further. Now, a core priority of what we've discussed in the South African context is digital inclusion as a driver for sustainable growth. But for a tech entrepreneur like yourself in Africa, digital inclusion isn't just about internet access. It's about reliable electricity, basic things like affordable data costs, and overcoming the infrastructure tax, so to speak, that does eat into startup margins. So when G20 talks about digital public infrastructure as a global equalizer, if you had a chance to sort of talk to the G20 Digital Economy Working Group, would you argue that they are in fact solving the right problems? Or how does the current definition of sustainability need to evolve to account for the unique infrastructure hurdles like power and connectivity that can often threaten the survival of early stage African tech ventures, so they never really get to the next point?
Great. Thank you so much for this question. And yes, it is definitely one that everybody feels if you're an entrepreneur on the continent. It hits very much close to home as an entrepreneur. Just having to spend so much money on basic utilities like electricity and just such like the high data costs. And you know that if I'm building the exact same startup and I was based in California, I would not have these same costs. So it is, as you said, an extra infrastructure tax that all companies have to face. And it is incredibly, frustrating. I also mentioned, like you said, the high cost of data, which is just not only a high expense for us as entrepreneurs building the products, but also for our customers having to use our products. It is so much more costly for them. And so it makes access and the usage of, digital products that much higher as well. So it is, such a critical thing that we need to be thinking about. And Another thing that I don't think is always mentioned is just the access to global digital infrastructure as well. So things like cloud storage, it's much more costly for a company based in Africa than it is for a company based in Silicon Valley. And I already mentioned having to cover basic things like electricity, internet power, and having to provide more of the social support for your employees that maybe companies that are based outside of the continent don't necessarily have to work to include because the government system already is able to cover some of that. So when you talk about sustainability for businesses, I think we all tend to just think of, creating sustainable business in terms of like environment and climate and things like that, which is definitely very important. But we also need to take perhaps a more like wider view of sustainability and thinking about, okay, the sustainability of the business themselves. And I do think that Africa is in quite a unique position to build products, not just for Africa, but for growing markets as a whole. And if we look at Silicon Valley, back in the day before Silicon Valley became what it was today, there were a lot of, tax breaks that startups were able to get in order to incentivize people to build for this market and for the world. So things like, tax credits for R&D and just tax breaks on profits and gains. And I think if I did have the ear, of the digital economy working group, I would really encourage them to look at what incentives can you give to startups to not only offset this infrastructure tax, to have more of a level playing field, but also to actually incentivize people to come and build here and building not just for, African markets, but also looking at building globally.
Thank you. Yeah, very well said. Now, Ira, I'm going to stay with you and come to you with a question from our audience. And this is from one of our alums who's a big champion for, issues related to sort of allyship by men for women. And so his question, I think, is very relevant, and I should address that to you. So Tabo's question is, the G20 drove other issues for women, such as tackling gender-based violence and the care economy, so unpaid care work. How do you see these issues supporting the empowerment of women? And have you seen examples of how men show up to support women on these issues?
Oh, yeah, this is a really great question because when you think about the inequality in gender in the working economy, a big issue that women face, in addition to being paid less than women for doing the same job, is the fact that their time is a lot more limited resource because in a lot of societies, women are still expected to take on a lot of the work or the unpaid labor that's outside of the traditional economy. So I think the support of those types of issues are incredibly important for the committees to really look into, because you have to take a much more holistic view when you're trying to tackle the issue of gender inequality. It's not just about, okay, paying women the same. It's also looking at, okay, what are the barriers for women to enter the economy, and how do you go about addressing that? There is also on the topic of like gender-based violence, there's a nonprofit that I'm a part of, which is called Stand to End Rape in Nigeria, and they do a lot of work with the government in terms of having a lot of like educational initiatives in order to educate people on, okay, what is sexual violence and that, because I think in a lot of the less educated regions of not only the country, but globally, a lot of the issues do also arise because of a lack of education. So I think initiatives like that are really important, and being able to work with governments to push these initiatives are really important. And we do see that men are also able to be a part of driving those initiatives as well. So I do see that a lot.
Thank you. And I'm going to push in one quick audience question for Vanessa, if you're able to answer very briefly, Vanessa. This question is about food security at scale, which is often only left to commercial farmers and big corporates, including agro-processors and FMCGs. So, our audience question is, how can we empower indigenous communities to play in food security locally and globally in a way that fairly rewards them? So, fair trade, given that there is economic inequity in the food value chain and ecosystem.
I get all the fun questions. This is great. So, let me start out by saying that I think that agricultural production and productivity has it's kind of like different recipes, right? So the recipes include how do you till your land? Are you cultivating specialty crops or is it, staple crops? Are you cultivating food for your local community, or is it for a higher income class community? And so there's a growing middle class demand for higher value commodities and crops and recognition for the source and the quality, whether it's organic and how the land and the farmers are being treated. But it's still just like in more developed markets, and like most people are highly price sensitive in their food purchasing, and any increment in price and cost of food, whether it be the cost of rice, ugali, or maize, or oil, it makes it unaffordable or accessible, let alone the cost of meat or protein. And so my answer to that is it depends for who and for which market and for which consumer and which price level and what kind of food selection and choices are possible. And for me, the biggest concern we should all be having is what should be fair to the consumer should be also reflected, not just fair to the farmers, in terms of around availability of nutritious, high quality and nutritious foods. So let's be looking at that nutritional content, protein availability, lowering malnutrition, both, and as well as overnutrition. People don't want to talk about the fact that there's a growing obesity as well as quality of food consumption issues and in certain markets. Consumption of highly refined wheat flour, which doesn't provide sufficient nutritious values and so on. Lack of food fortification standards that are being applied. So I think fair is complex, and it's about availability, accessibility, nutritious, quality, and safe food. And that's fair for the consumers and also for the farmers. But for one, every time I buy food, I want to know where it comes from, through it, how they grew it, and I encourage all of us in our various communities and environments to look at fair labor standards across the board. But again, availability remains a huge issue. We're relying on imports for large quantities of food. Even recently, I was looking at statistics. Somalia is importing $2 billion of food a year. Somalia. And, why aren't we trading from Ethiopia and Kenya into Somalia, for example? Because the logistics costs are high and the distribution costs and the holding costs. So let's not have let's allow ourselves to live in a complicated world of food distribution and trade opportunities. And the trade wars that policies are even amongst African countries imposing higher costs and fees as we trade across borders, although we've signed on to free trade protocols both regionally and continentally. So I think it's a practice what you preach, Case. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it has to happen at every level for consumers.
Indeed.
Thanks.
Yes, and as you said, fair is never easy. It's always going to be complex. So certainly that's something we can all empathize with. Now, a lot more that we can talk about, but I'm being reminded that we are out of time. I do think that we've covered some very important, substantial themes that emerged from the G20 meeting. So let's, I think, all continue to think about and work on the themes of inclusive leadership and sustainable growth across all the areas that we've discussed today, and that were the focal points of South Africa's leadership of G20. These are all themes that matter not just to the continent, but to the whole world. And there is perhaps a unique opportunity now for Africa to take the lead in these aspects. With that, a big thank you to our wonderful panelists for your insights and for sharing your thoughts. And as I said, we will be sharing this video across various channels and possibly also do a short write-up on what you've talked to us about. So thank you so much for your time today, and we will continue to stay connected with you. And to our audience who are watching now and will download and watch this video in the future, great to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Vinika. Thanks to
Thank
my
you so
panelists.
much.
Thank you for making the time.